The Silent Hunt, March 16, 1943, 2:47 a.m., mid-Atlantic, 850 nautical miles southwest of Iceland. Captain Lieutenant Ernst Bauer pressed his forehead against the cold rubber eyepiece of U-boat 267's periscope, scanning the ink-black horizon. The diesel engines had fallen silent 20 minutes ago, leaving only the rhythmic drip of condensation from the pressure hull and the shallow breathing of 42 men suspended in darkness. Through the lens, he could see nothing, just the endless void where sky met water, both equally black, both equally hostile. "Funker," he whispered, his voice barely carrying 3 meters to the radio operator's station. "Anything?" Obergefreiter Klaus Hoffmann adjusted his headphones, his fingers hovering over the Enigma machine's keys. Static crackled through the speakers, the Atlantic's endless voice, a cacophony of atmospheric interference, distant thunderstorms, and the electromagnetic chaos generated by hundreds of ships, submarines, and aircraft transmitting across thousands of kilometers. The Germans called it the curtain, a wall of radio noise so dense that finding a single transmission was like isolating one raindrop in a hurricane. "Negative, Herr Kaleo," Hoffmann replied. "Only the usual noise." "If BDU is transmitting coordinates, it's buried somewhere in there." Bauer nodded, satisfied. The Befehlshaber der U-Boote, U-Boat Command, had assured them repeatedly the Atlantic's radio environment was their greatest protection. Every submarine in the Wolfpack generated signals. Every Allied convoy broadcast weather reports, position updates, escort communications. The electromagnetic spectrum was so saturated that Allied direction-finding equipment couldn't possibly separate signal from noise, couldn't identify which blip represented a U-boat transmission and which was just another piece of the ocean's endless static. Or so they believed. 800 kilometers to the northeast, RAF Ballykelly, Northern Ireland. Flight Lieutenant Margaret Ashworth removed her headphones and marked another notation on the plotting table, her movements precise despite 36 consecutive hours on duty. The HF-DF receiver, officially designated Type FH-4, unofficially called Huff-Duff by every operator who used it, had just registered its 14th signal intercept of the night. The oscilloscope displayed a sharp vertical spike amidst the background interference, lasting exactly 2.8 seconds. Short, professional. German. "Bearing 235 degrees, she announced, her voice steady, despite the exhaustion pressing against her temples. "Signal strength suggests range between 600 and 800 nautical miles." Across the operations room, Lieutenant Commander James Whitmore compared her bearing with similar reports, arriving via secure teleprinter from HF-DF stations in Iceland, Newfoundland, and the Azores. On the massive plotting table before him, 4 lines converged. each representing a directional bearing from a different listening station, intersecting at a point in the mid-Atlantic where, theoretically, no vessel should exist, according to Allied convoy routing. But submarines existed there, multiple submarines. And every time one of them transmitted, even for 3 seconds, even believing the signal was hidden in the Atlantic's electromagnetic chaos, the HFDF network captured it, triangulated it, and plotted it with accuracy measured in single-digit nautical miles. "That's the 6th transmission from this general area in 4 hours, Whitmore said, adding another pin to the map. "They're forming up, gathering the pack before the attack." The technology of silence. The development of high-frequency direction finding represented one of the war's most critical yet least celebrated technological achievements. Unlike radar, which actively transmitted signals and waited for reflections, HFDF was purely passive, a sophisticated radio receiver that could detect the electromagnetic signature of any transmission and determine its direction with remarkable precision. The physics were elegant. When a radio transmitter generated electromagnetic waves, those waves propagated outward in all directions. An HFDF receiver employed a rotating antenna system, sometimes a fixed circular array of multiple antennas, sometimes a physically rotating loop, that could determine from which direction the signal strength was strongest. The operator would slowly rotate the antenna or electronically scan the array, watching a cathode ray oscilloscope for the peak signal strength. That direction became a line on a map, extending from the listening station toward the source. One bearing alone revealed little, just a direction, not a location. But when multiple HFDF stations, hundreds or thousands of kilometers apart, detected the same transmission, their bearings intersected. The German submarine that believed its 3-second encrypted message was hidden in the Atlantic's radio noise had just announced its position with geometric precision. January 1942. Bletchley Park, England. Hut 8. Dr. Robert Watson Watt, the physicist whose work had laid the foundation for British radar development, stood before a chalkboard covered in mathematical expressions and frequency diagrams. Around him, a dozen Royal Navy officers and civilian scientists crowded into the cramped wooden structure, their breath visible in the unheated air. The Germans believe the electromagnetic environment protects them, Watson Watt explained, tapping his chalk against a frequency spectrum diagram. And they're partially correct. The Atlantic generates tremendous radio noise, atmospheric disturbances, lightning, solar interference. Add to that the thousands of legitimate transmissions from ships, aircraft, and shore stations, and you have what appears to be insurmountable interference. He drew a sharp vertical line on the spectrum. But German U-boat transmissions have distinctive characteristics. They're short-burst, high-frequency signals, typically lasting between 2 and 8 seconds. They use specific frequency bands, and crucially, they occur in patterns, Coordinated Wolfpack communications generate clusters of transmissions as boats report contacts, receive orders, and coordinate attacks. Commander Roger Wynne, the Admiralty's chief of submarine tracking, leaned forward. "So we can identify them." "More than identify," Watson Watt replied. "We can locate them. The Royal Canadian Navy has already established HFDF stations along the Newfoundland coast. Iceland has 3 operational stations. We're building more in Northern Ireland, the Azores, and West Africa. Each station operates as a node in a network. When a U-boat transmits, multiple stations detect it simultaneously. We compare bearings, triangulate the source, and plot the position." He pointed to a map of the Atlantic. "The Germans have built their entire tactical doctrine around radio communication. The Wolfpack concept requires constant coordination. Boats reporting convoy sightings, BDU transmitting attack orders, submarines updating positions. Each transmission we intercept becomes a point of light in the darkness. Enough points, and we can map the entire Wolfpack distribution across the Atlantic." Now, the network expands. By March 1943, the Allied HFDF network had grown from a handful of experimental stations to a comprehensive surveillance system spanning 3 continents and multiple ocean basins. The stations varied in capability. Some were massive fixed installations with multiple antenna arrays and dedicated analysis teams. Others were compact mobile units deployed to remote coastal locations. But all fed data into a centralized tracking system at the Admiralty's submarine tracking room in London. Western Approaches Command, Liverpool, England. The submarine tracking room occupied an underground bunker beneath Derby House, its walls lined with plotting tables that displayed the entire Atlantic Ocean at 1:250,000 scale. Different colored pins marked convoy positions, blue; suspected U-boat locations, red; confirmed U-boat sinkings, black; and HFDF intercepts, yellow. By mid-March 1943, the yellow pins had proliferated across the plotting tables like stars emerging after sunset, each one representing a German transmission captured and triangulated by the network. Commander Wynne stood before the main plotting table, studying the pattern with the intensity of an astronomer examining a new constellation. 43 yellow pins formed a rough arc across the mid-Atlantic, roughly following the Great Circle route between Newfoundland and the British Isles. The distribution wasn't random. Clusters of pins indicated Wolfpack concentration points where multiple U-boats had gathered, waiting for convoys to pass through their patrol areas. "They're broadcasting more frequently," observed Lieutenant Commander Patrick Beasley, Wynne's deputy. "Either they've received new operational orders from BDU, or they're regrouping after the SC-121 action." Wynne nodded slowly. Convoy SC-121 had departed New York 8 days earlier, carrying 59 merchant ships loaded with aviation fuel, ammunition, steel, and food bound for Britain. The convoy had already lost 13 vessels to U-boat attacks, one of the worst convoy battles of the war, but the submarines had paid a price. Allied escorts equipped with shipborne HF-DF sets had detected U-boat transmissions during the attack, vectoring destroyers and corvettes directly toward surfaced submarines before they could submerge. 3 U-boats had been sunk, 2 damaged severely enough to abort their patrols. The Germans didn't yet realize what had happened. They attributed the losses to improved Allied radar, to chance encounters with patrol aircraft, to anything except the possibility that every radio transmission they made was being tracked, plotted, and used to guide countermeasures. "Plot the intercepts against known convoy routes," Wynne ordered. "I want to see where they're concentrating." Within 30 minutes, the pattern emerged with crystalline clarity. Gruppe Raubgraf, 8 U-boats operating under the command of Kapitän zur See Eberhard Gott, had established a patrol line directly across the projected route of convoy HX-229, a fast convoy of 40 merchant ships currently 3 days out from New York. The convoy was running without adequate escort. Most destroyers had been diverted to protect the battered remnants of SC-121, making it vulnerable to coordinated Wolfpack attack. But this time, the Allies knew exactly where the submarines were waiting. The Wolfpack assembles, March 17, 1943. U-boat 267, Mid-Atlantic. Captain Lieutenant Bauer reviewed the decoded message for the 3rd time, committing the coordinates to memory before passing the paper to his executive officer for destruction. BDU's orders were explicit. Proceed to position 50 Sud degree 13, 35 degree 15 W, and await further instructions. 7 other boats from Gruppe Raubgraf would converge on the same coordinates, forming a patrol line 60 kilometers wide across the convoy routes. The strategy was simple, elegant, and had proven effective dozens of times. The submarines would spread out in a line perpendicular to the expected convoy course, maintaining radio silence except for brief position reports every 6 hours. When one boat sighted a convoy, it would shadow at extreme range, transmitting contact reports that would bring the entire Wolfpack converging on the target. Multiple submarines attacking simultaneously from different directions would overwhelm the escorts, allowing each boat to make multiple attacks before withdrawing. "We'll reach the position in 14 hours, Bauer announced, studying the chart spread across the tiny navigation table. "Maintain radio silence except for scheduled reports." "Surface intervals at periscope depth only. I want minimum exposure." What Bauer didn't know, what no U-boat commander yet understood, was that those scheduled position reports, those brief 3-second transmissions using unbreakable Enigma encryption, were systematically compromising every Wolfpack operation in the Atlantic, HFDF station, Cape Race, Newfoundland. Petty Officer Thomas MacDonald sat before the Type FH4 receiver, slowly rotating the direction-finding loop antenna while watching the signal strength meter. The display showed constant background noise, the familiar hash of atmospheric interference that characterized Atlantic radio conditions. But 30 seconds ago, he detected a brief spike at 4680 kilohertz, one of the frequencies commonly used by U-boats. He waited, headphones pressed tight against his ears, fingers poised over the bearing notation pad. German submarines often transmitted in pairs, a primary message followed by a confirmation receipt, generating 2 intercepts within minutes. If he could capture both, it would provide confirmation that the signal represented actual submarine traffic rather than atmospheric anomaly. 3 minutes later, the spike reappeared. Duration, 3.2 seconds. Direction, 165 degrees true. Signal strength, moderate, suggesting a source perhaps 700 nautical miles distant. MacDonald logged the intercept, noting the precise time, frequency, bearing, and signal characteristics. Within 2 minutes, the information had been encrypted and transmitted to Western Approaches Command via secure teleprinter. Within 4 minutes, it had been plotted on the submarine tracking room's main table, where it intersected with similar bearings from stations in Iceland and Northern Ireland. The intersection point fell precisely within the area BDU had designated for Gruppe Raubgraf's assembly. The Allies were reading the map before the Germans finished drawing it. U-boat 523, 180 kilometers west of U-267. Korvettenkapitän Werner Hartenstein surfaced his boat at 0400 hours, the conning tower breaking through moderate seas with a cascade of phosphorescent spray. The diesel engines roared to life, their familiar thunder drowning out the softer sounds of ocean and wind. After 16 hours submerged, the boat needed to ventilate, recharge batteries, and transmit the required position report to BDU. Hartenstein climbed through the conning tower hatch, followed by the watch officer and 2 lookouts. The night air was cold, damp, carrying the salt taste of the Atlantic. Visibility extended perhaps 3 kilometers under the quarter moon, enough to spot a convoy's silhouette against the horizon, but not enough to make U-523 an easy target for patrolling aircraft. "Make it quick," Hartenstein ordered, ducking back into the conning tower where the radio operator waited with the encrypted message. 3 seconds maximum, then we dive. The transmission was textbook perfect. U-523's Enigma encrypted position report traveled at the speed of light across 850 kilometers of ocean, bounced off the ionosphere, and arrived at BDU's headquarters in Paris within milliseconds. The message contained 12 groups of 4 letters each: position, fuel status, torpedo inventory, weather conditions, all compressed into a format that required exactly 2.9 seconds to transmit. But that transmission also traveled to HFDF stations in Newfoundland, Iceland, Northern Ireland, and the Azores. Within 6 minutes, 4 bearing lines converged on Western Approaches Command's plotting table, intersecting at a point just 18 nautical miles from U-523's actual position. A new yellow pin joined the growing constellation. The convoy diverts March 17, 1943, 18:30 hours. HMS Volunteer, escort destroyer for convoy HX-229. Commander Donald McIntyre stood on the destroyer's bridge wing, studying the encrypted message that had just arrived via high-frequency radio. The thin paper fluttered in the Atlantic wind, but the content was clear. Western Approaches Command had detected a Wolfpack concentration directly across HX-229's projected course. 8 U-boats, positions plotted with remarkable precision, waiting in a line, stretching 60 kilometers across the convoy route. The orders were equally clear. Alter course 30 degrees south, maintain radio silence except for encrypted command signals, and increase speed to 11 knots. The maneuver would add 12 hours to the crossing time and consume precious fuel, but it would route the convoy around the submarine ambush entirely. "Signal the convoy Commodore," McIntyre ordered. "Course change to 095 degrees, execute in 30 minutes. All ships to maintain strict emission control, no radio, no radar unless absolutely necessary." Lieutenant James Fenwick, the ship's communications officer, raised an eyebrow. "Sir, how did the Admiralty identify submarine positions with such precision? Those coordinates are accurate to within a few miles." McIntyre smiled grimly. "New detection equipment, Lieutenant, and the less said about it, the better." "The Germans don't know we can track them, and I'd prefer to keep it that way." What McIntyre didn't say, what only a handful of officers at Western Approaches Command fully understood, was that HFDF had fundamentally altered the mathematics of convoy warfare. Before the network became operational, routing convoys through the Atlantic resembled a high-stakes game of chance. The ocean was vast. Submarine positions were estimates at best, and convoy commanders made routing decisions based on incomplete information and educated guesses. Now every German transmission created a data point. Every Wolfpack assembly generated a cluster of intercepts. The Allies could see the submarines gathering, could plot their patrol lines, could route convoys around the ambushes before the U-boats even knew a convoy was approaching. The hunters had become the hunted, tracked by their own communications. 30 minutes later, HMS Volunteer, the convoy executed its course change with the ponderous precision of 40 merchant ships attempting coordinated maneuvers at night. 40 hulls, tankers, freighters, Liberty ships loaded with aircraft, tanks, food and ammunition, altered course in response to signal lamps flickering from the escort screen. The formation's turn radius extended over 3 kilometers of ocean, the outer columns traveling faster than the inner ones to maintain formation integrity. McIntyre watched the evolution from the bridge wing, counting ships as they completed the turn. 1, 2, 3, 38, 39, 40, all accounted for. The convoy's new course would carry them 150 kilometers south of the waiting submarine patrol line, passing through an area where HFDF intercepts indicated no U-boat presence. "All ships have acknowledged the course change, sir," Fenwick reported. "Formation integrity maintained. Very well. Reduce speed to 9.5 knots once we're settled on the new course. I want to conserve fuel." Below decks, HMS Volunteer's HFDF operator sat before a modified Type FH-4 receiver, one of the new shipborne units that allowed destroyers to detect and track U-boat transmissions independently of shore stations. The equipment was cramped into a tiny compartment barely 2 meters square, sharing space with radar equipment and communication gear, but it had already proven its value in previous convoy battles. Able seaman Robert Harrison adjusted the receiver's frequency dial, scanning the U-boat communication bands for any sign of transmission. The speaker produced the familiar static hash of Atlantic radio conditions: atmospheric noise, distant thunderstorms, the electromagnetic chaos that the Germans believed protected their communications. But Harrison had learned to distinguish between natural interference and the sharp, artificial signatures of German radio transmitters. At 1947 hours, he detected a brief spike at 4720 kHz, duration 2.6 seconds. Bearing 342 degrees true, approximately 80 nautical miles distant. Harrison logged the intercept and immediately reported it to the bridge. "U-boat transmission, sir," he announced via sound-powered phone. "Bearing 342, estimated range 60 to 100 miles. Brief burst, probably a position report or contact message." McIntyre checked the plot. Bearing 342 placed the submarine north of the convoy's original track, exactly where Gruppe Raubgraf was supposed to be waiting. The fact that a submarine was transmitting suggested it hadn't detected HX-229's course change yet. The Wolfpack was still waiting for prey that would never arrive. The empty ocean, March 18, 1943. 0600 hours. U-boat 267. Captain Lieutenant Bauer had been on watch for 7 consecutive hours, scanning the horizon through binoculars until his eyes burned with fatigue. Dawn was breaking over the Atlantic, painting the eastern sky with bands of orange and pink that reflected off the rolling swells. Visibility extended to 15 kilometers in the clear morning air, perfect conditions for spotting a convoy's smoke plumes against the horizon. But the horizon remained empty. 7 other U-boats from Gruppe Raubgraf maintained their patrol line positions, spaced at 8-kilometer intervals along a north-south axis perpendicular to the convoy routes. According to BDU's intelligence, based on convoy departure schedules and typical crossing speeds, HX-229 should have entered their patrol zone sometime during the night. Instead, the submarines had detected nothing: no smoke, no radar contacts, no hydrophone signatures of merchant ship propellers. "Anything on hydrophones?" Bauer asked, his voice hoarse from the cold night air. The hydrophone operator shook his head. "Negative, Herr Callot." Some distant biologics, probably a whale pod, but no mechanical signatures. Bauer lowered his binoculars and studied the chart. Either BDU's intelligence was wrong about the convoy's position, or HX-229 had altered course. But why? The Atlantic was vast, and the probability of accidentally avoiding a 60-kilometer patrol line seemed impossibly small, unless... "They're routing around us," he muttered, the realization arriving like a punch to the stomach. "Somehow they know we're here." His executive officer, Oberleutnant Zurse Klaus Meyer, climbed through the conning tower hatch. "That's impossible, Herr Kallow. We've maintained strict emission control. The only transmissions have been the required position reports, and those are encrypted with Enigma. The British can't possibly decrypt them in real time." Bauer wasn't so certain. 3 patrols ago, U-267 had been part of Gruppe Stürmer, a Wolfpack that had waited for convoy ONS 166 north of the Azores. The convoy had inexplicably altered course, passing 50 kilometers south of the patrol line. BDU had attributed it to chance, to random routing variations, but now, facing another empty ocean where a convoy should have been, coincidence seemed less likely. "Signal BDU," Bauer ordered. "Report no contact with HX-229. Request updated intelligence on convoy routing." The transmission took 3.4 seconds. Within 8 minutes, it had been detected by HFDF stations in Iceland, Northern Ireland, and the Azores. The bearing lines converged on the submarine tracking room's plot with textbook precision, confirming that Gruppe Raubgraf remained in position, still waiting for a convoy that had already passed safely to the south. The pattern emerges. Western Approaches Command, Liverpool, March 18th, 1943. Commander Roger Wynne added another notation to his running log of convoy battles and submarine dispositions. HX-229 had successfully evaded Gruppe Raubgraf, passing through the mid-Atlantic without making contact with a single U-boat. The convoy would arrive in Liverpool in 4 days, with all 40 ships intact. A remarkable achievement given the intensity of the Battle of the Atlantic in early 1943. But what made the success particularly significant was that it wasn't an isolated incident. Over the previous 6 weeks, Western Approaches Command had routed 17 convoys around detected Wolfpack positions using HFDF intelligence. 13 had completed their crossings without U-boat contact. 3 had suffered minor attacks after submarines accidentally encountered them outside the main patrol zones. Only 1, the unfortunate SC-121, had been caught and mauled before it could execute evasive maneuvers. The statistics represented a fundamental shift in the Atlantic battle. In January 1943, U-boats had sunk 53 Allied merchant ships totaling 320,000 tons. By March, despite increasing numbers of operational submarines, the sinking rate had dropped to 37 ships and 220,000 tons. The U-boat force was expanding while its effectiveness declined, a paradox that had BDU's staff increasingly frustrated and confused. Lieutenant Commander Beasley spread a series of photographs across the plotting table. The images, taken by Coastal Command reconnaissance aircraft, showed surfaced U-boats at various positions across the Atlantic. Each photograph had been cross-referenced with HFDF intercepts, confirming that the bearing triangulations were accurate to within 5 nautical miles. "The Germans still don't understand what's happening," Beasley observed. "They keep attributing their failures to improved radar, to larger escort groups, to better air cover." BDU's operational orders show no indication they suspect we're tracking their radio transmissions. Wynne studied the photographs, noting the submarine's confident surface postures, conning towers fully manned, deck guns uncovered, lookouts posted. The U-boat commanders believed the Atlantic's electromagnetic environment protected them, that the curtain of radio noise rendered their transmissions untraceable. "How long before they figure it out?" Wynne asked. "Months, possibly longer." The evidence is circumstantial from their perspective. Convoys altering course could be random routing variations. Escorts arriving at submarine positions could be lucky radar contacts. As long as we're careful not to reveal the source of our intelligence, no direct references to HFDF in tactical communications, no obvious patterns in convoy routing, they'll keep searching for alternative explanations. Wynne nodded slowly. The operational security surrounding HFDF had been absolute. Only senior officers at Western Approaches Command, the Admiralty, and a handful of escort commanders knew the full capabilities of the detection network. Even ship captains whose vessels carried HFDF equipment often believed it was simply improved radio direction finding gear, not a sophisticated triangulation system that could track submarines across thousands of kilometers. "The longer they remain ignorant, the more effective the system becomes," Wynne said. Every transmission they make strengthens our picture of their dispositions. Every Wolfpack they assemble becomes visible to us, and every time they wait in empty ocean for convoys that never arrive, their morale degrades further. The questions begin. BDU Headquarters, Paris, March 20th, 1943. Gross Admiral Karl Dönitz stood before the operations map in the command center beneath the Hotel am Steinplatz, his expression darkening as staff officers updated the tactical situation. Gruppe Raubgraf had been disbanded after failing to make contact with any convoys during its 5-day patrol. Gruppe Stürmer, operating southwest of Iceland, had detected only one Allied convoy in 3 weeks, sinking 2 merchants before aggressive escort action forced the submarines to withdraw. Gruppe Neptune, positioned on the southern convoy routes, had made no contacts whatsoever. The pattern was disturbing. U-boat force strength had reached its highest level of the war, over 400 operational submarines, with new boats joining the Atlantic force every week. Yet Allied shipping losses were declining. Convoy routing seemed almost prescient, as if the British knew exactly where Wolfpacks were positioned and actively maneuvered to avoid them. "Explain this to me," Dönitz demanded, gesturing at the operations board where Wolfpack positions were plotted in red alongside known convoy tracks in blue. The 2 sets of lines rarely intersected. How are the British routing 20 convoys per month through the Atlantic without encountering our patrol lines? The ocean isn't that large. Kapitän zur See Eberhard Gott, BDU's operations chief, consulted his notes. "Several possibilities, Herr Großadmiral. First, improved Allied intelligence from aerial reconnaissance. Patrol aircraft may be spotting our boats during transit and reporting positions. Second, advances in Allied radar. The British may have developed longer-range systems that detect surfaced submarines at greater distances. Third, expanded escort coverage. More destroyer groups means convoys can be rerouted quickly when submarines are detected," Dunitz shook his head. Those factors should improve their defensive capabilities, but they don't explain the precision of convoy routing. Look at this. He pointed to a cluster of red marks northeast of Newfoundland. Gruppe Raubgraf waited here for 5 days. 5 days! During that time, 3 convoys passed within 200 kilometers, 1 to the north, 2 to the south. The probability of that happening by chance is vanishingly small. Perhaps their code breaking has improved, suggested Korvettenkapitän Gunther Hessler, Dönitz's son-in-law and a senior operations officer. If they can decrypt our Enigma transmissions, they would know Wolfpack positions and convoy routes simultaneously. The suggestion triggered immediate controversy. Dönitz had absolute confidence in Enigma's security. The encryption machine generated trillions of possible key combinations, changed settings daily according to codebooks, and employed sophisticated protocols that made decryption theoretically impossible without captured equipment and current key settings. German cryptographic experts had repeatedly assured him that Allied code breaking posed no significant threat. Impossible, Dönitz stated flatly. The Enigma system is mathematically unbreakable, even if the British captured a machine, and we have no evidence they have. They couldn't decrypt messages without the daily key settings, and those change at midnight every day. But doubt had been planted. Over the following weeks, BDU staff would analyze patrol reports, transmission logs, and operational patterns, searching for evidence of compromised communication security. They would examine whether certain types of transmissions, position reports, contact signals, weather data, correlated with increased Allied activity. They would compare the timing of U-boat radio traffic with subsequent convoy routing changes. The analysis would eventually lead them to radar, to improved Allied anti-submarine tactics, to enhanced aerial coverage, to aggressive escort tactics. It would lead them to a dozen different explanations, each plausible, each partially supported by evidence. It would not lead them to HFDF, not for months, not until the damage was irreversible. The Shipborne Revolution, May 1943. HMS Starling, Bay of Biscay. Commander Frederick Johnny Walker positioned himself at HMS Starling's HFDF console, watching the Type FH-4's cathode ray display with the intensity of a chess master studying a critical position. His destroyer was leading the second support group, 6 escort vessels operating as an independent submarine hunting force through waters where German U-boats transited between French bases and Atlantic patrol zones. The HFDF display showed a spike at bearing 287 degrees, range estimated at 30 kilometers, duration 4.1 seconds. The transmission's characteristics, frequency, duration, signal pattern matched known U-boat communication protocols. Contact, Walker announced calmly. Bearing 287, range 20 to 40 kilometers, probably a weather report or position update to BDU. HMS Starling's plotting officer immediately marked the bearing on the tactical plot. Within 2 minutes, similar bearings arrived from HMS Wren and HMS Woodpecker, 2 other destroyers in the support group equipped with HFDF systems. The 3 bearing lines converged at a point 32 kilometers west-southwest, defining the submarine's position with remarkable precision. Set course 270, Walker ordered. Speed 25 knots. Signal the group submarine contact via HF-DF, prosecuting bearing 287. Formation Baker 3, prepare for coordinated attack. The shipborne HF-DF systems represented the next evolution of the technology. Shore-based stations could triangulate submarine positions across vast ocean areas, enabling strategic routing of convoys around Wolfpack concentrations. But shipborne systems allowed escorts to detect nearby U-boats independently, vectoring directly toward submarines that transmitted within detection range. The tactical implications were profound. Previously, U-boat commanders could surface at night with reasonable confidence, transmit brief messages to BDU, and submerge before Allied forces could react. The ocean was dark, radar range was limited, and the probability of chance encounter with an escort was acceptably small. Now, every transmission within 80 kilometers of an HF-DF-equipped escort triggered an immediate response. Destroyers altered course and accelerated toward the bearing, using the submarine's own communication to guide the attack. The U-boat commander who surfaced to report a convoy sighting might find himself under depth charge attack within 30 minutes, the escort having homed directly on his transmission. 38 minutes later. HMS Starling's ASDIC operator detected a submerged contact at 200 meters, bearing 284 degrees. The sonar return was solid, sharp-edged, moving at 8 knots on a northerly heading. A submarine, definitely a submarine, running submerged after detecting approaching destroyers. ASDIC contact, the operator announced. Classification submarine, bearing 284, range 1200 meters, speed 8 knots, course 010. Walker smiled tightly. The HF-DF bearing had placed them within perfect attack position, downwind and down-sun from the submarine, approaching from the target's quarter, where hydrophone detection was most difficult. The U-boat commander probably didn't even know he was being hunted until Starling's powerful propellers appeared on his hydrophones, by which time escape was impossible. "Attack team, commence approach," Walker ordered. "Prepare full pattern, depth settings 300 and 500 feet. "We'll bracket him." HMS Starling accelerated to attack speed, the destroyer's bow wave climbing as she drove toward the contact. The ASDIC pings accelerated, steady, mechanical, counting down the range. 800 meters, 600, 400. Fire! 26 depth charges rolled off Starling's stern racks and fired from her side throwers, creating a three-dimensional pattern of explosions that bracketed the submarine's estimated position. The ocean erupted in massive columns of water and spray, the detonations sending shockwaves rippling across the surface in expanding circles. Walker waited, watching for evidence of destruction, oil slicks, debris, air bubbles, but the sea remained disturbed only by the depth charge turbulence, slowly settling back to its normal rolling pattern. "ASDIC contact lost," the operator reported. "Heavy turbulence in the target area, attempting to reacquire." The submarine had survived the first attack, but its situation was desperate. Submerged, pursued by 6 destroyers equipped with ASDIC and depth charges, low on battery power after the high-speed evasion, the U-boat had limited options. It could try to outmaneuver the escorts, hoping to break contact in the thermal layers. It could dive deep and attempt to hide beneath the searching sonar. Or it could surface and fight, a suicidal option against 6 destroyers, but at least providing a chance to transmit a final position report before the end. The hunt continued for 3 more hours, HMS Starling and her consorts maintaining persistent contact, attacking repeatedly, driving the submarine deeper and deeper until battery exhaustion forced it to surface or suffocate. At 1647 hours, a massive oil slick bubbled to the surface, followed by debris, wooden planking, life jackets, personal items. The submarine had imploded under pressure, its hull finally surrendering to the accumulated damage from multiple depth charge attacks. Walker ordered the debris photographed and collected for intelligence analysis. Among the recovered items was a waterlogged notebook containing U-boat operating procedures, patrol schedules, and communication protocols. Valuable intelligence that would be rushed to Western Approach's command for exploitation. But the most valuable intelligence had already been collected. The HFDF intercept that initiated the hunt had confirmed what analysts increasingly suspected. German submarines were transmitting more frequently as the Atlantic battle intensified, generating more intercepts, creating more opportunities for detection and attack. The hunters had become the hunted, and they still didn't understand why. The cost becomes unbearable. BDU headquarters, Paris, May 24, 1943. Gross Admiral Dönitz studied the casualty reports with mounting alarm. May 1943 had become the worst month in U-boat force history. 41 submarines sunk, 41 crews lost, over 2,000 men dead or captured. The losses exceeded new construction. For the first time since war began, the operational U-boat force was shrinking rather than growing. The statistics painted a grim picture. In May alone, Allied convoys had crossed the Atlantic with minimal losses. Only 34 merchant ships sunk compared to 96 in March. U-boat kills per submarine deployed had dropped to 0.18, meaning each operational U-boat averaged less than 1/5 of a merchant ship sunk per patrol. The mathematical exchange rate had reversed catastrophically. The Allies were building merchant ships faster than U-boats could sink them, while simultaneously destroying submarines faster than Germany could replace them. Effective immediately, Dönitz announced, his voice heavy with reluctance. All U-boats in the North Atlantic are to withdraw to defensive positions southwest of the Azores. We're suspending Wolfpack operations pending analysis of Allied detection capabilities and development of countermeasures. The decision was unprecedented. For 3 years, German U-boats had dominated the Atlantic, sinking millions of tons of Allied shipping, threatening Britain's survival. Now faced with losses they couldn't sustain, and an enemy that somehow knew where submarines were positioned before they attacked, the U-boat force was retreating. But the retreat came too late to save the men already at sea, still transmitting position reports and contact signals, still believing the Atlantic's radio noise protected their communications. U-boat 954, Mid-Atlantic, May 19th, 1943. Captain Lieutenant Odo Love surfaced his boat at 2200 hours to transmit the required position report to BDU. The night was clear and calm, visibility extending to 10 kilometers under a half-moon. Perfect conditions for transmitting, Love thought, and perfect conditions for being detected by HF-DF systems he didn't know existed. The transmission lasted 8 seconds, longer than ideal, but necessary to include fuel status, weather data, and a report of possible convoy smoke sighted earlier that day. The encrypted message traveled through the ether at light speed, reaching BDU headquarters in Paris within milliseconds. It also reached HF-DF stations in Newfoundland, Iceland, Northern Ireland, and shipborne units, with 3 escort groups operating within 200 kilometers of U-954's position. Within 6 minutes, 7 bearing lines converged on plotting tables across the North Atlantic, all intersecting at a point that marked U-954's location with 5-kilometer accuracy. HMS Jed, a destroyer equipped with Type FH-4 and operating just 60 kilometers from U-954, received the intercept data and immediately altered course to 245 degrees, increasing speed to 28 knots. The submarine was close, very close, and transmitting meant it was surfaced, vulnerable, potentially still on the surface when Jed arrived. 23 minutes later, HMS Jed's radar detected a surface contact at 8,000 meters, bearing 248 degrees. The contact was small, low in the water, exactly the signature generated by a surface submarine's conning tower. Surface contact, bearing 248, range 8,000 meters, the radar operator reported. Classification, probable submarine. Commander Richard Stanner, Jed's captain, didn't hesitate. Action stations. Illuminate target with searchlight when we close to 4,000 meters. Gun crews prepare to engage. U-954 detected the approaching destroyer at 6,000 meters, her bridge lookout spotting the characteristic bow wave of a warship at high speed. Love immediately ordered emergency dive, but the British destroyer was too close, closing too fast. Before U-954 could submerge, HMS Jed's searchlight blazed across the water, illuminating the submarine's conning tower in harsh white light. Jed's 4-inch guns opened fire immediately, the shells screaming across the water and impacting around the submarine. One round struck U-954's pressure hull just forward of the conning tower, the explosion sending shrapnel tearing through steel plating and into the control room. Another hit the conning tower itself, killing 3 lookouts instantly. Louis tried to dive, but the damage was catastrophic. Water flooded through the shell hole, overwhelming the pumps, dragging the submarine down stern first in an uncontrolled descent. At 180 meters depth, the weakened pressure hull imploded, the collapse propagating through the entire structure in a fraction of a second. U-954 ceased to exist, taking all 48 crew members with her. HMS Jed detected the submarine's death through ASDIC, the sudden unmistakable signature of hull collapse, followed by the sounds of debris tumbling into the deep. Stannard ordered the area searched for survivors, but the Atlantic yielded nothing except an expanding oil slick and a few floating pieces of wood. The entire engagement, from HFDF intercept to U-954's destruction, had lasted 41 minutes. The submarine's position report, transmitted believing the Atlantic's radio noise rendered it undetectable, had instead served as a beacon guiding the destroyer directly to its target. It was a pattern repeating across the Atlantic dozens of times per month. Every transmission became a potential death sentence, and still, the Germans didn't understand. The realization dawns BDU headquarters, Paris, June 1943. Korvettenkapitän Günther Hessler laid out a series of patrol reports and loss analyses across the conference table, his expression grim. 3 weeks of intensive investigation had finally produced answers, partial answers, incomplete answers, but answers nonetheless regarding Allied detection capabilities. The evidence is now conclusive, Hessler announced to the assembled staff officers. The Allies possess detection equipment that can locate surfaced submarines at ranges far exceeding our previous estimates. Multiple loss reports mention destroyers appearing shortly after radio transmissions, approaching directly from downwind positions optimal for radar detection. Dönitz leaned forward, studying the reports. Radar? Almost certainly, Herr Großadmiral. The British have apparently developed centimetric radar systems operating at much shorter wavelengths than our current METOX receivers can detect. When our boats surface to transmit, they're immediately visible to Allied radar at ranges of 15 to 20 kilometers. The explanation was plausible, partially correct, and critically incomplete. Allied centimetric radar had indeed improved dramatically, allowing escort vessels to detect surfaced submarines at extended ranges. But radar alone couldn't explain convoy routing changes, couldn't account for destroyers arriving at submarine positions before transmissions occurred, couldn't justify the systematic tracking of Wolfpack formations across thousands of kilometers. What the German analysis missed, what operational security had successfully obscured, was HFDF, the shore-based triangulation network, the ship-borne direction-finding systems. The entire architecture that turned German radio transmissions into navigation beacons for Allied forces. Recommendations? Dönitz asked. Restrict radio transmissions to absolute minimum, Hessler replied. Position reports only when critical. No weather data unless specifically requested. Contact reports only for confirmed convoy sightings, and develop new radar warning receivers that can detect centimetric wavelengths. Whoa! The new protocols reduced U-boat radio traffic by approximately 60%, making Wolfpack coordination more difficult but theoretically reducing detection probability. Submarines would maintain longer radio silence, transmit only when tactically necessary, and rely more on independent hunting rather than coordinated pack tactics. But the damage was done. Six months of intensive HF-DF exploitation had mapped the German U-boat force's operational patterns, communication procedures, and tactical doctrines. Allied analysts understood how Wolfpacks formed, how they communicated, how they attacked. That knowledge would remain valid even as transmission frequency decreased. And critically, the Germans still attributed their losses to radar, an explanation that was true but incomplete, leaving them blind to the full scope of Allied detection capabilities. The Legacy Western Approaches Command, Liverpool, November 1943. Commander Roger Wynne stood before the plotting table, observing the dramatic transformation in Atlantic convoy operations. The yellow pins marking HF-DF intercepts had thinned considerably since June. German submarines were transmitting less frequently, maintaining longer radio silence, operating more independently. But the damage to U-boat effectiveness was irreversible. Allied shipping losses had dropped from 320,000 tons per month in January to less than 100,000 tons by November. The U-boat force, which had peaked at over 400 operational submarines in May, had been reduced to fewer than 200 effective boats after catastrophic losses. New German submarines were entering service equipped with improved radar detectors, snorkels for submerged diesel operation, and acoustic torpedoes. But these innovations came too late to reverse the strategic situation. The Battle of the Atlantic, while not over, had decisively shifted in Allied favor. And HF-DF had played a crucial role in that transformation. The final irony, Lieutenant Commander Beasley observed, studying the plotting table, is that the Germans never fully understood what defeated them. They developed explanations, improved Allied radar, stronger escort groups, better air coverage, all of which were true. But they never grasped that their own radio communications, which they believed were protected by the Atlantic's electromagnetic noise, were actually revealing their positions with precision. Wynne nodded slowly. The intelligence classification will need to remain in place for decades. If the Germans, or future adversaries, learn that direction finding can provide such accurate targeting information, they'll develop countermeasures. Better encryption, burst transmission systems, frequency hopping protocols. The conversation reflected a broader truth about intelligence operations. The most successful capabilities were those the enemy never discovered, never understood, never countered. HFDF had succeeded not just because the technology worked, but because operational security prevented the Germans from realizing how thoroughly their communications had been compromised. Decades later, the full story of HFDF and its role in the Battle of the Atlantic would remain classified until the 1970s, when declassified documents finally revealed the extent of Allied signals intelligence capabilities during World War II. Historians analyzing the newly released material would recognize that HFDF represented one of the war's critical force multipliers, a technology that, combined with code breaking at Bletchley Park, radar development, and improved anti-submarine weapons, had transformed the Atlantic from a German hunting ground into an Allied killing zone. The lessons would influence naval warfare for generations. Modern naval forces would develop sophisticated emissions control protocols, recognizing that every radio transmission represented a potential targeting beacon. Submarine communications would evolve toward burst transmission systems, extremely low-frequency channels, and satellite-based networks that minimize detection risk. But in the spring of 1943, when the Battle of the Atlantic reached its crisis point, the Germans had learned those lessons too late. Their submarines continued transmitting, believing the ocean's radio noise protected them, while Allied HFDF stations tracked every signal, plotted every position, and guided escorts toward their targets with mathematical precision. The technology of silence had become the technology of death, and the electromagnetic curtain that German commanders believed concealed their submarines had instead illuminated them for destruction.